Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home. I must have done about 40 Moggcasts with Jacob Rees-Mogg. This is the very first one live. I'm very grateful to Jacob for doing it. Welcome, Jacob.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'm very grateful to be invited to do the Moggcast. It's always enjoyable.
We're very pleased to see you. As a couple of announcements before we start, many thanks to Thorncliffe, our sponsor, and this event is running live on YouTube. So let's start, Jacob, with the event of the day, which was the Prime Minister's speech. It's very much a traditional kind of Boris Johnson speech, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, it was. It showed all his virtues, that it was clear, it was upbeat, it was funny at times, but also the Prime Minister has always had an underlying seriousness to everything that he said. So I think it brought everything together very, very well and effectively.
What we didn't hear today in detail was how the government's going to solve one of its central problems with the coronavirus. If you can't get testing and tracking to work, the government's going to be forced to go down other avenues, not least because Conservative backbenchers, led apparently by no less a person than Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee, are getting a bit restive. Now, if you can't get test and trace right, you're going to be forced to do more lockdowns unless a vaccine comes along or the disease burns itself out, or you'll have to take a less restrictive approach like Sweden. So what's the next stage for test and track, and when are the problems going to be sorted out?
Well, first of all, I think it's very easy to focus on the negative and what hasn't worked rather than what has worked. And it is worth bearing in mind that in March of this year, there was virtually no testing at all, and now 250,000 people a day are being tested. And that's something that's been achieved by British scientists and has made possible a very extensive testing regime. And when it's all running smoothly and when every test is coming back quickly, you don't hear very much about it. But inevitably, there are occasional glitches. And when those occur, people focus on them and say the whole system doesn't work. And I don't think that's fair. I think the system is evolving, it's improving, a mistake has been identified and has been put right. But everybody who had the coronavirus over the last week or 10 days, whilst this problem was around, has been notified. And everyone in that position will have told members of their family that they have got the virus. And in their own household, the whole household will have to self-isolate. So it's no pretense that not adding up the figures correctly hasn't been a success. But the overall picture is better than I think you're indicating.
First of all, of course, it's quite right to say that we didn't have a test and track industry at all in March, and that's been built up. And naturally, you're right to mention that. But the picture is not encouraging, because in the countries where testing and tracing has worked best, some of the Far Eastern countries, you don't need lockdowns at all. You have very local lockdowns in areas and streets, much smaller than the really big area lockdowns we've had here. So until or unless testing and tracing works in that way, we are stuck with these big lockdowns.
I think it's true to say that 500,000 people have so far been tested and traced and therefore have had to self-isolate for a period. So significant numbers have been involved. And you raised the fascinating question of other countries' experience. And it's very difficult at this early stage to work out why some countries have had different results than others, why some countries have had approaches that seem to have worked, why others have had approaches that have apparently not worked so well, whether it's in test or tracing, where actually the UK has done comparatively well, whether it's in the total number of deaths or the deaths per million people. And I think we will eventually find out why there were differences, and this may relate to demographic features, it may relate to societal features, it may be that Confucian societies are more willing to follow the rules laid down by the state than Western societies are. So there will be a number of factors as to why one country has done better or worse than another. And I think it's too early to draw any direct conclusions from that. We just have to try and do what we can in our own country and to do our best to make this system work and to use a combination of test and trace and the local lockdowns that are being used to try and keep things under control.
Some of your colleagues and also some of our readers who, if our surveys are right, increasingly think what I'm about to say, some of your colleagues are looking with sympathy at a kind of Swedish type solution and are saying the damage to the economy isn't worth the express aim of suppressing the virus, which Matt Hancock has confirmed is now the aim. It's also, as well as doing damage to livelihoods, there's also damage to lives, because the focus on the coronavirus means all sorts of other problems, cancer, cancelled hospital appointments, mental health difficulties, abuse. All these add up, and even in health terms, the coronavirus isn't really worth these costs, lives as well as livelihoods. So what do you say when your colleagues say that? And do you think this is a growing view among
them? First of all, I think if Conservative MPs weren't standing up for liberty, the Conservative Party wouldn't be doing what it exists for. This is what you expect Conservative MPs to do. And it's important in a democracy that these arguments are made, and that whenever the government takes extraordinary powers, that the government is challenged over taking those powers. And what I say to Conservative MPs, many of whom are friends of mine who I work very closely with in certain roles over recent years in relation more to the European issue, what I say to them is that this is not a decision the Prime Minister has come to lightly, but that there is the risk that those who call for a more Swedish model, those who think that restrictions could be lifted earlier or matters could be eased, are wrong. And if they're wrong, the risk to life is potentially very considerable. And the Prime Minister has to weigh this up, and he's the one with the responsibilities on his shoulders to decide. And although I am very keen on liberty, I am a proper Conservative in my view in that way, and although I absolutely understand what my friends on the backbenches are saying, if I were the Prime Minister, I would come to the same conclusion as Boris Johnson, because there's a risk that this more optimistic view is wrong, and that risk is too great a one to take. And therefore the Prime Minister has to balance the competing arguments, the competing strains, the competing issues around lives. Which way is the right way to save the most lives after all? And in my view, he's got that balance right.
Just first question on this theme from Debbie Flint, who sent in a question that asked, with less than 100 people a week dying of coronavirus, what's the chance of restrictions being eased in time for Christmas?
That's a very hard question to answer, because the problem with this disease, as we saw earlier in the year, was the doubling rate. Now, if something doubles every 3 days, it goes up by 1,000-fold in a month, 1,000,000-fold in 2 months, and 1,000,000,000-fold in 3 months. And so the power of compound interest is behind all the needs to tackle this problem and all the focus on the R number and the reproduction rate. And so 100 a day could, as it did last time, rise very rapidly. It might not because of the state at which the disease is, but it could. And therefore I think it would be unwise of any minister to give any guarantees about Christmas beyond the hope that we can have an easier Christmas than currently looks likely. But that is a hope rather than a promise, and certainly not a guarantee.
The Prime Minister's not been able to rule out more restrictions. Do you have a contingency plan to close the Commons chamber, as you had to do earlier this year?
The business of Parliament needs to carry on. And it needs to carry on two grounds. One is the government must be held to account on what it does in relation to the coronavirus. And Parliament needs to sit to be able to pass new rules of national significance, as has been promised by the Health Secretary. And that's very important. We can't delegate or abdicate that. We also need to be around to pursue the government's legislative agenda, not least ensuring that all the statutory instruments and laws are in place for us to leave the transition period on the 31st of December. So there are major reasons why Parliament must sit, why Parliament is an essential service. And if you think of people in supermarkets, they've worked throughout. You know, they've had some protective measures put up, some perspex screens put up. They've tried to work in COVID secure ways. They've been real heroes of this, and I think often unsung. I think MPs look a little bit unstrong, to put it mildly, if they feel they must be protected more than their own constituents. And I think we have a job to do. But are there no circumstances where we might have to go back to more remote? I couldn't say that, but it certainly would be very much a last resort.
I can hear that you're clearly very unwilling to do it. And remember your passionate case in the chamber for getting the Commons, keeping the Commons back when it happened. Totally different.
Well, it's our duty. It's our duty. We owe it to our constituents to be there, and the police are working, the nurses are working, doctors are working, supermarket workers are working, the cleaning people in the House of Commons have been working throughout this period. And I think for MPs to say, well, we're too delicate to go in, is a bit much, unless it were a very extreme circumstance.
You're making a very strong case publicly, aren't you, to your colleagues and the Prime Minister not to see Parliament closed again in the way that it was?
I mean, there is a strong view with many people I speak to ensure that we remain open.
Can you explain why the Prime Minister's encouraged people to go to cinemas, but pubs must be left by 10 p.m?
Well, yes, it's very straightforward. Let's talk about churches rather than cinemas, because you and I may prefer going to churches than to cinemas. But if I go to church with my family, with 6 children and my wife, and we fill up one row in a completely COVID secure way, as long as the row before us and behind us is empty. And if you apply that to a cinema, you could have 8 paying customers taking up a block of seats perfectly safely, as long as the area behind them is clear. So you can get numbers into cinemas, in some cases, in a coronavirus safe fashion. And it's part of economic activity. I must confess, if the James Bond film were coming out, I would be much more enthusiastic about going to cinema. It's one of the things I always try and see.
You could have socially distanced arrangements in pubs, could you not? Indeed, many pubs have done that.
Well, and people are going to pubs and restaurants until 10 o'clock, and the regulations have been tightened to try and ensure that pubs are COVID-safe environments.
What's the magic of 10 p.m. rather than 9 p.m. or 11 p.m?
Well, it's all a balance, as you know, and perhaps it has a relationship with the quantity of alcohol drunk, conceivably.
Okay, let's get off the coronavirus and talk about something else. If you were an American citizen, would you vote this November for Trump or Biden?
I'm not an American citizen, though my grandmother was, and she last voted, I'm rather sorry to say, for Jimmy Carter in 1976. She didn't live long enough to have the chance of voting for Ronald Reagan in 1980. But I'm not an American citizen, and I think British politicians giving an indication of what they would do, particularly ministers, in an American election is not well received by our friends in America. But I think it is of fundamental importance that the British government gets on with the American government, whoever its leader happens to be. That is in the British national interest.
Backbenchers, of course, have a certain freedom, and you'll remember, as I do, in 2010 or so, during the David Cameron period, There was great enthusiasm for Obama, rather surprising, given the Conservative Party's traditional links to the Republicans. What are your colleagues saying about the election?
Well, you'll have to ask them. And as a backbencher, I exercised this freedom. So you could look up what I said 4 years ago if you wanted to play a little trick on me, and see whether that was still my view or not. But Obama came to this country and told us that we would be at the back of the queue. During the Brexit campaign, I made my views very clear about important foreign figures interfering in our elections. And I didn't think much of that. And therefore I don't think much of us interfering in their elections. You may remember, it was very funny, when Guardian readers decided to write to people, I think in Oregon, when it was a swing state, to try and stop George Bush Jr. being elected. And it made all the good people of Oregon think they would vote for Mr. Bush rather than being told what to do by the Guardian. So I think one has to tread very carefully in this area.
Putting it in a different way, what do you admire about Donald Trump?
Well, I think particularly, actually, his Supreme Court appointments. I think that he has managed to come up with nominees of the highest caliber who are going to be very significant in the development of American jurisprudence for potentially a very long time. It could be the most significant part of his legacy, in addition to his remarkably successful foreign policy.
Question from C.R. Marshall. Are you pleased that Lawrence Fox has started a new political party to promote our history and values? And why, he asks, has the Conservative Party made no effort to defend our culture over the last 10 years?
Well, I think it's a bit much to say we've made no efforts to defend our culture. We've left the European Union, which seems a pretty good way of defending our culture from the European superstate and the way that the EU has been heading. So I'm sorry to disagree with a distinguished subscriber to Conservative Home, but I can't accept that characterization. Mr. Fox has set up a party, and I think people involving themselves in the political process is a welcome thing. But actually, if you look at what Oliver Dowden has just written to museums, the Tory party is very good at defending our culture and standing up for what is great about our nation. And we should be so proud of the United Kingdom. And before it, the predecessor nations. We have achieved so much, not just for ourselves, but for the world. I think we have made an enormous contribution to the development of prosperity and advancement of democracy across the globe.
Do you know Lawrence Fox, by the way?
No, I've never met him.
And how do you feel while we're on this vulgar subject of personalities? Were you disappointed that Charles Moore ruled himself out to be chairman of the BBC?
I'm one of many of Charles Moore's great admirers. I read during the lockdown, as I think I discussed with you, or perhaps I read it after we had the discussion on what I was reading, the third volume of his biography of Margaret Thatcher, which, if there is, I don't believe there's any other Conservative Home subscriber who hasn't read this, but if there is, read it immediately. It's absolutely brilliant and gripping, and he is a proper Tory hero. And I think any job he did, he would do with great distinction and elan. However, my father was vice chairman of the BBC, and of all the jobs he ever did in any field of work, his role at the BBC was the one he most disliked. So I'm not sure I would try and inflict that particular role on anybody.
It does seem to be the case that Boris Johnson favoured appointing him, did he not?
How would I know? You know these things before I get told. You know, you journalists are always the ones who hear the lobby gossip first.
That's why I'm asking you, as leader of the House, you're supremely well informed about what your colleagues.
I know gossip because I read it in the newspapers, but I don't know it through official channels.
All right, let's move from gossip to a big policy question of the trade talks. Richard Binstead asks, why do we need to compromise? Why can't we just leave under WTO rules and then approach the EU for an FTA next year as a fully sovereign nation?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I think the questioner is actually very aligned to the Prime Minister's position that if we can agree a Canadian-style trade deal, which is a perfectly normal trade deal between sovereign nations, that's fine. If not, we'll deal on Australian terms. But that we are not going to allow the European Union to carry on running the United Kingdom's internal or external affairs. And that's why the UK Internal Markets Bill was so important, because it made provision for us taking back powers to the United Kingdom.
But of course, you'd rather see a deal, would you not?
Only the right deal. I remember that if we can get an agreement that is a free trade agreement between sovereign nations, or between a sovereign nation and an international organization, which is a lesser standard than a sovereign nation. I mean, a collection of sovereign nations does not have the high democratic underpinning of a sovereign nation. But if we were able to get that type of a deal, yes, I'd be in favor of it. But I'm very happy to trade, or for the country to trade, with the European Union in the same way as Australia does, one of our closest and friendliest allies.
Next question's from rather a typical kind of question, not untypical in a way, from Louise Croft. I'm a lifelong Conservative voter, but recently have been alienated by the government's plans for HS2, relaxing planning laws and net zero. How can you persuade me to continue my support?
Governments have to make choices, and not all choices are easy, and many of them have countervailing pressures against them. I think that if you take the planning reforms, we are faced with a real problem that the average age of people buying their home, or their first home, has gone up and up. The size of houses that people live in has gone down, and the size of the space around them has gone down. And we are short of houses, and they're at very high prices. And we have a responsibility that people should be able to achieve their lifetime's ambitions. Before lockdown, I used to speak quite regularly to universities, and I would always ask the audience there if they wanted to own their own home by the age of 35. And invariably, people's hands went up. Only in a very small number of places did people actually think they would achieve this by the age of 35. And I think those of us who live in nice properties have a responsibility to help those who want to get on the housing ladder to do so. And I think that's a very Conservative thing to do. And I think the socialist planning system introduced by Attlee doesn't work any longer. And therefore it needs reform. And it needs reform to provide beautiful houses. Because I think if we build what people actually want, and this is very interesting because opinion surveys going back to the 1940s say that people want houses with gardens, 80% of people. And consistently governments have tried to make them have tower blocks and things that they don't want. If we can provide things that people want and are beautiful, then I think we will win hearts and minds over reforming the planning system. I live in Somerset. The local council is the Bath and North East Somerset Council. It seems to me it's inconceivable that that council, well organised as it may be, would give permission for the Royal Crescent in Bath under current planning laws. And yet the Royal Crescent in Bath is one of the most beautiful crescents anywhere in the world. So we have a planning system that seems to me to be anti-beauty. And no wonder Conservatives have concerns. But at the heart of reforms must be beauty, as the Secretary of State has said. As regards HS2, there is an argument about capacity on the railways and the need to increase the capacity. And as with building roads and other infrastructure projects, that is very disadvantageous for people living nearby. And this was absolutely true in the 19th century when the main railway network was being built. It wasn't easy and it had opposition. But sometimes these big long-term projects are in the national interest.
Tara Douglas-Hume asks, what should you do if your old college in Oxford was proposing to tear down historical statues?
Well, first of all, I'm very glad to hear from Tara, who I have known since childhood. So I'm glad that he is paying attention this evening. Fortunately, my old college isn't trying to tear down statues. I think it's a particularly silly thing to do, that we should not be ashamed of our history. We should understand our history. And I do accept that there are some figures in British history who are not perfect. I think that Colston in Bristol was not somebody who one would want to go out to defend, that he was a slaver of the most appalling kind and seems to have salved his conscience in later life by philanthropic work. And that's no bad thing, but the base of his money is a bad thing. And I think he's a very hard figure to defend. But other figures in our history are very distinguished and helped freedom spread across the world. So I don't think we should reject our history, and I don't think we should tear down statues.
You wouldn't lie down in front of the bulldozers, as the Prime Minister once said he'd do in relation to Heathrow, I think.
I have a nasty feeling that, considering my general spindliness, a bulldozer would make pretty short work of me. So I think I'd probably rather work through a parliamentary mechanism.
Assuming your doesn't happen and you're still with us, Tom Newton-Dunn, name rings a bell somehow, asks, what's your favourite radio station these days? What's the one you have on in the car?
Well, I have two favourite radio stations. One is, of course, the Times Radio, which I think is absolutely excellent, and the other is LBC. So the two of them, I think, provide a very good balance. The Times is not the most right-wing radio station in the world, but LBC gives a little bit of right-wing bite sometimes, particularly with the very distinguished Nick Ferrari, who I enjoy listening to. Mind you, I've now left out my friend Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk Radio, who's magnificent and always goes into bat with panache.
A different sort of question from Peter Diver, who sent in a question about closer ties with Canada, Australia and New Zealand, political ties as well as economic ties. He didn't use the word I'm about to use, but the question is undoubtedly about it. CANZUK. What's your view?
Canada, Australia, New Zealand are our closest allies, along with the United States. One of the sadnesses about our European Union membership was the way in which we treated some of our closest allies. And it always seemed to me disagreeable that people coming from a country with which we shared a sovereign, and I include the other ones too, so places like Jamaica, had to queue up for hours to get through immigration, whereas people with whom we did not share a sovereign could just waltz through. This seemed to me to be a wrong order of priorities. And so I think establishing better relations, trying to repair the damage we did to our relations by Ted Heath's European romanticism is a jolly good thing.
Are you in favour of making immigration easier between the CANZUK countries, would-be CANZUK countries?
Well, there are particular facilities between them already, and they are able to use the e-gates nowadays, which I think is a very good thing. I think I'd better not preempt what immigration policy will be, but I think it's a really strong argument to make that we should oblige our friends.
Clive Guthrie Andrews asks, would you support social care being paid for increasingly from a ring-fenced income tax?
Let me deal in generalities, because I mustn't tread on the Chancellor's toes, otherwise his bootmaker would be upset. The issue with hypothecated taxation as a fundamental Treasury view is that it never actually works. And why does it not work? Because it either has too much money or too little money, and the hypothecation ends up being theoretical. The classic example of this was, of course, the road fund license that ended up with too much money in it, so it got raided, and road taxes haven't been spent on the roads for a very, very long time. You saw an example when the National Lottery started up, and it did enormously well, much better than people expected, and so in the end, Tony Blair raided it for the National Health Service because it had more money than it could sensibly spend. You've seen it year in, year out with national insurance, and the National Insurance Fund is much more theoretical than it's real. So hypothecated taxation is not a sensible economic route.
The question, of course, wasn't just about hypothecation. The hypothecation was a sort of an element of it. The question, I suppose, was also asking about really whether social care should be sort of funded nationally, which would imply bringing it in with the NHS, wouldn't it?
Well, remarkable thing. Just before I joined the administration headed by Boris Johnson, I wrote the foreword to a pamphlet by Policy Exchange on social care, which advocated taking this on board as a government priority. And the argument that that paper made was that one of the biggest costs that a small number of individuals face is social care, and that the general responsibility of the government is to take on costs that people can't of themselves individually afford. And almost no family can afford the costs of social care. And that therefore it was genuinely something that the community ought to take on. And that seemed to me to be an argument that was strong enough to be worth writing the foreword to the paper for. But I am now bound by collective responsibility, so I cannot express my own personal view on this.
You flickered in and out on my Zoom, but I did catch the words policy exchange. I was going to raise your paper, but you've answered that question, so we'll move on. Keith Miles asks, are you in favour of making the BBC part licence fee, part subscription funded?
I think this is the challenge for the next chairman of the BBC, that if you look at the BBC's revenues, they have been broadly stagnant in real terms now for decades, whereas other companies, be they Sky or Netflix or whatever company you choose to mention, has seen a fundamental change in its level of revenues. And that's why the BBC is no longer competitive in terms of the sport that it buys. It doesn't have the cricket, it doesn't have the football. It's why Netflix is able to spend so much more on the programs that it makes. So the challenge for the BBC is that if it wishes to remain an internationally renowned broadcaster, it needs more money. And how is it to get that in a way that is acceptable to the British taxpayer? Because the licence fee is a tax, it's a poll tax. And historically, poll taxes in this country haven't proved very popular. Indeed, you and I can remember some riots in 1990 in opposition to one particular poll tax. And we recall the efforts of Richard II in response to another poll tax. So poll taxes have their problems, and the BBC, to be globally competitive, needs a greater revenue. And therefore, the new chairman will need to work out how to deal with that.
Next question. I'm busy looking down the list. Oh, well, here's one lots of people do ask. From Denver Trawler. Does Jacob agree it's imperative we get fans back in our football stadiums for the survival of our lower league clubs? He asks, such as my Southend United. There you go.
I mean, I was very sorry not to be able to see any cricket over the summer. I normally get to see Somerset a bit, and I normally manage to see a test match or two. So I was very sorry not to see any cricket, and that was one of the problems that we face at the moment. And I absolutely understand the issue with the lower league football clubs. I actually discovered today that the Football Association has been making payments to lower league clubs, and a number in my own constituency have benefited. But the real answer is that we all want to get back to normal as soon as possible. That is the Prime Minister's view. It's the view of every sensible person. And that means allowing people back into stadiums, but at the right time, when it is the sensible thing to do and doesn't risk further transmission of the coronavirus.
And your colleague, Douglas Ross, made a very strong virtual speech to the virtual conference this week, in which he was extremely critical of a trend, as he saw it, towards English nationalism that, in his view, threatened the union. And he was actually critical about it in relation to some people within the Conservative Party itself. What do you think he was getting at?
I don't know, but I'm not an English nationalist. I have no interest in English nationalism. I think that the United Kingdom is my country and Somerset is my county, and that those are the two bits to which I owe loyalty. Now, like a lot of people living in England, I sometimes make the mistake of saying England when I mean the United Kingdom, but I don't do that out of any disrespect to the rest of the United Kingdom. I do it out of error, which I sometimes fall into. But the United Kingdom is a great nation, a world-beating nation, and chopping it up into little bits seems to me deeply unattractive. And English nationalism misses the point that England benefits hugely through being part of the United Kingdom. We benefit by our ties of kinship with the other parts of the United Kingdom and by the world-beating nature of the United Kingdom. And so I see no attraction in English nationalism. And I think there are very few issues to which English nationalism would ever conceivably be the answer.
Douglas Ross said a very striking sentence in his speech: many, including some who govern our country, want to see a UK government focus on England. What do you think he was getting at?
I don't know. I don't speak to anyone in government who I think wants to focus on English nationalism. I think there is, in the Prime Minister's words, a levelling up agenda which applies to the whole United Kingdom. And indeed, the UKIN bill makes provision for expenditures to take place by the UK government in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and gives extended spending power, because it was realised that some of the ability to help that there was in England during the coronavirus didn't exist directly for the UK government, HM government, across the whole of the country. So I think the push in government is unionist and is not Englishist.
What podcasts do you listen to? One of the readers asks.
There's a very, very good one on Somerset County cricket, which I would recommend, which I listen to from time to time. And I listen to odd podcasts that pop up on audiobooks, which I listen to endlessly. I'm very keen on audiobooks because I drive quite a lot, and it's something to listen to in the car.
Since you've raised the subject of books, and you wrote a historical book, published it fairly recently, what's your next book idea?
Oh, mine. I'm not going to write my diaries. I'm not going to compete with Lady Swire. I have no immediate plans, and whilst I'm in government, there's not a lot of time. But my book on the Victorians, you'll be glad to know, came out in paperback about a week ago, available, probably discounted in all sorts of stores. And so no doubt people will be rushing off to get them now.
I must rush off in due course. I do, of course, need to buy the Sacha Swire diaries and look up to see if your name's in the index. Have you read them?
No, I read the extract. They were in the Daily Mail, weren't they, or were they in the Times? I can't remember. Anyway, I read them, absolutely gripped, but felt, I'm afraid, rather sort of less of myself for reading them, because the Holy Father had said about a week before how terrible gossip was, and there I was, absolutely gripped by a book that was very interesting gossip.
I lost a part of your answer, but I got the gist. We're moving towards the end because sadly we're running short of time. I have a question from Tracy Pears, which was this. It's a two-part question actually. Let's do the first part first. If you could ask Sir Winston Churchill one question, what would it be?
That is a very hard question. I think I would ask him what influence his realization that going on the gold standard was a mistake had in his later political career. And why would I ask that? Because Churchill was always very willing to challenge experts later in his career, but went on to the gold standard because it's what all the experts told him to do. And I'd be very interested to see whether the era of the gold standard fundamentally influenced and advanced his willingness to challenge people.
Do you think he might have acquired a greater sympathy for John Maynard Keynes in consequence? Because Keynes tried to persuade him to myth the gold standard, was rather a crucial summit, I think, with 3 other participants. And Churchill decided in the end, after much agonising, he wouldn't go.
That's right. If I remember rightly from the history I've read, there was a dinner in 11 Downing Street, and Keynes was the only one who said that you could go off the gold standard, and Montague Norman and everybody else said, no, that's a ridiculous idea. And Churchill was unwilling to listen to the one contrary voice. And I'm sure that must have made him think more of Keynes. And interestingly, we should be thinking more of Keynes at the moment, because it seems to me that the response to the coronavirus, the correct economic response in my view, and one that people like John Redwood have supported, has been a very Keynesian one. And that people think Keynes always said you should splash about more public money, but he didn't. He thought public money, taxpayers' money, should be used in certain circumstances when there was no other route available. And I think that describes exactly the situation that there was earlier in this year. So perhaps it's time for a re-evaluation of Keynesianism and its the correct applicability of Keynesianism rather than the erroneous applicability of it in the 60s and 70s.
The second half of Tracy Pear's question was less historical and academic, if you like, which was supplementary question. Would you consider doing a 2021 calendar, please?
A 2021 calendar?
Calendar, yes, you know. You turn over the months and you get different photographs of Jacob Rees-Mogg, presumably, perhaps along the lines of Calendar Girls.
I don't think I'd do that. I think if I were to do a calendar, I could do, I've got 6 children, so it works rather neatly. I could give each one 2 months. I think that would be much more attractive and amusing than to have one with me on, which I think would not sell very well. They might be popular in dart playing communities if their dartboard needed recovering.
Well, Jacob, we've done the coronavirus, we've done Brexit. I've taken as many questions as I can. Many apologies to the readers who couldn't get in. I'm very grateful to you for sparing us 3/4 of an hour for this live Moggcast, and hope we can do it again soon. I've been asked to say, if readers wish to make a contribution towards our costs, they're very welcome to get in touch via the website and offer. Again, I want to thank Thorncliffe, our sponsor. This Moggcast will appear live very soon on YouTube and iTunes and other providers. And we will resume our normal Moggcast, I hope, not by Zoom, but in person, with Parliament still sitting, as you hope, very soon. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Good night.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.